In the decades after the Cold War hardened into doctrine and habit, Iraqi military planners studied conflicts not as stories of heroism, but as diagnostic case files. They were looking for patterns, moments when modern armies behaved in ways that defied expectations. One such case kept resurfacing in foreign military journals, professional staff colleges, and translated United States Army studies. Chipyong-ni, February 1951. To Iraqi generals trained in the logic of encirclement and psychological collapse, the battle read less like history and more like an anomaly that refused to resolve itself. Iraqi doctrine, shaped by Soviet operational art and reinforced through wars with Iran and coalition forces, treated encirclement as a decisive condition. A surrounded unit cut off from fuel, ammunition, and maneuver space was expected to degrade rapidly. Command and control would fracture. Morale would collapse. Surrender, breakout, or destruction were the only rational end states. This belief was not uniquely Iraqi. It was shared across much of the 20th century. What made Chipyong-ni unsettling was that none of those outcomes occurred when theory said they must. The Iraqi officers reading these accounts were not studying the battle for its geography or its era, but for its implications. A United States regimental combat team, isolated deep in hostile territory, surrounded on all sides in winter conditions, refused to retreat and did not attempt an immediate breakout. Instead, it consolidated inward. To Iraqi planners, this ran counter to every lesson drawn from mechanized warfare and attritional campaigns. Encirclement was supposed to compress and suffocate. At Chipyong-ni, it appeared to harden the defense. What drew particular attention was not bravery as an abstract quality, but decisions. The American force deliberately accepted encirclement as a temporary operational condition rather than a terminal one. Firepower was reorganized for all-direction defense. Artillery was repositioned inside the perimeter rather than behind it, trading depth for immediacy. Airpower and logistics were treated as extensions of the battlefield rather than supporting functions. For officers raised on linear fronts and rear areas, this blurred the distinction between front line and sanctuary. Iraqi generals reading these studies in the 1980s and 90s did not see Chipyong-ni as an ancient episode. They saw a warning. If an encircled force could remain supplied, coordinate fires, and deny the attacker psychological momentum, encirclement alone lost its power as a decision mechanism. The battle suggested that modern warfare was no longer governed solely by geometry and numbers, but by integration of communications, logistics, and the will to remain static under pressure. Chipyong-ni unsettled Iraqi doctrine because it implied that surrounding an American unit did not necessarily mean defeating it. Sometimes it meant concentrating oneself inside a deliberately constructed killing zone. For Iraqi officers trained in Soviet-style operational planning, the unsettling lesson of Chipyong-ni lay not in terrain or weather, but in the way the encircled force managed control under pressure. Iraqi doctrine emphasized centralized command with carefully sequenced phases. Once a unit became surrounded, radio discipline typically degraded, senior commanders lost situational awareness, and subordinate formations waited for orders that no longer arrived. Chipyong-ni presented the opposite pattern. The surrounded American force did not descend into radio chaos. Its communications traffic, as later declassified transcripts showed, remained concise, standardized, and focused almost entirely on fire coordination. This detail mattered to Iraqi generals because their own experience suggested that encirclement magnified friction faster than firepower. During the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, Iraqi units caught in partial encirclement often suffered collapse even when numerically superior, largely due to disrupted command and logistics. Chipyong-ni contradicted that experience. The American regimental headquarters remained functional despite isolation, not by preserving maneuver, but by redefining it. Instead of moving units across ground, commanders maneuvered effects, artillery fires, machine gun coverage, illumination, and reserves held tightly behind the perimeter. Another point of professional discomfort was the American willingness to accept extreme ammunition expenditure. Iraqi planners were accustomed to rationing fire under encirclement, conserving rounds for a breakout or final defense. At Chipyong-ni, ammunition was expended at a rate that appeared reckless by conventional siege logic. To Iraqi analysts, this only made sense when viewed through the lens of assured resupply. The battle demonstrated that air-delivered logistics could neutralize one of Encirclement's oldest weapons: starvation. Once ammunition and medical supplies could be dropped accurately by air, isolation no longer meant depletion on a predictable timeline. The Iraqi General Staff also took note of the American approach to perimeter geometry. Rather than stretching defenses thin to cover ground, the encircled force compressed inward, shortening internal lines and increasing mutual support. This ran against the instinct to maintain outward-facing space. The result was a dense, overlapping field of fire that punished attackers long before they reached decisive distance. Iraqi doctrine emphasized penetration and exploitation. Chipyong-ni showed the danger of attacking a static, prepared defense without sufficient heavy breaching assets. Most troubling of all was the psychological inversion. Iraqi training treated encirclement as a morale weapon first and a tactical condition second. Chipyong-ni suggested the inverse could also be true. When the encircled force accepted the condition deliberately, morale flowed inward rather than outward. The attackers, not the defenders, absorbed uncertainty. For Iraqi generals reading the case decades later, the lesson was stark. Against an opponent able to integrate airpower, logistics, and disciplined command, surrounding the enemy might not end the fight. It might only begin a more dangerous phase of it. Iraqi military education institutions incorporated Chipyong-ni into staff-level discussions. Attention increasingly shifted from leadership decisions to technology's role in sustaining an encircled force. Iraqi generals were particularly struck by how American systems blurred the line between tactical survival and operational dominance. Chipyong-ni illustrated that encirclement was no longer purely a ground problem. It was an air, communications, and fires problem layered on top of terrain. Airpower emerged as the decisive equalizer. Iraqi officers noted that the surrounded force did not rely on aircraft primarily for close air support in the traditional sense. Instead, air assets reshaped the battlefield's physics. Aerial illumination denied the attacker darkness, a condition Iraqi and Soviet doctrines alike treated as a sanctuary for infantry maneuver. Once the night could be artificially removed, infiltration lost its protective veil. To planners accustomed to using darkness to offset technological inferiority, this was a sobering revelation. Control of the vertical dimension could nullify centuries-old tactical assumptions. Equally important was the integration of ground-based fire systems into the perimeter itself. Iraqi doctrine separated frontline infantry from artillery, which was considered a rear-echelon asset vulnerable to penetration. Chipyong-ni reversed this logic. Heavy guns were pulled inside the defensive ring, shortening response times and allowing direct coordination with forward observers. Iraqi analysts recognized the risk inherent in this choice, but also its payoff. Artillery ceased to be a distant support arm and became part of the immediate defensive fabric, capable of firing at ranges normally considered unsafe. This willingness to accept internal danger in exchange for external lethality challenged deeply ingrained safety conventions. Technology alone, however, did not explain the outcome. Iraqi generals observed that the American advantage was not simply superior weapons, but superior integration. Radios, fire direction centers, aviation units, and logistics aircraft operated as a single system. Each component compensated for the vulnerabilities of the others. Encirclement, which normally fragmented systems, instead concentrated them. The Americans reduced the number of variables they needed to manage by reducing maneuver space. Fewer axes meant clearer priorities. For Iraqi planners, this had unsettling implications for future conflict with technologically advanced adversaries. It suggested that efforts to surround and isolate such forces might inadvertently increase their efficiency by compressing their defensive geometry. The assumption that pressure would automatically cause disintegration no longer held. Instead, pressure could force adaptation faster than anticipated. Chipyong-ni also reframed the concept of tempo. Iraqi doctrine emphasized maintaining offensive momentum to deny defenders time to reorganize. The Americans at Chipyong-ni deliberately slowed the battle down. They accepted static combat, betting that time favored the side with superior logistics, sensors, and coordination. For Iraqi generals studying the case years later, the conclusion was unavoidable. Against a force capable of sustaining itself from the air and dominating the night, encirclement without decisive breaching power risked turning initiative into attrition. By the time Iraqi generals reached the later analytical layers of the Chipyong-ni case, their focus moved from technology and firepower to institutional culture. The battle posed an uncomfortable question. Why did one army remain cohesive when isolation should have fractured it, while others historically collapsed under similar pressure? Iraqi analysts increasingly concluded that the answer lay not in individual courage, but in training systems designed for autonomy under extreme stress. American units at Chipyong-ni operated within a command philosophy that assumed disruption as a norm rather than an exception. Subordinate leaders were expected to act within commanders' intent without continuous guidance. For Iraqi officers raised in more hierarchical structures, this contrasted sharply with their own experience, where initiative often stalled in the absence of explicit orders. Chipyong-ni suggested that decentralization was not a luxury, but a survival mechanism once communications became degraded or commanders overwhelmed. Another aspect that drew Iraqi attention was how the encircled force managed reserves. Instead of dispersing manpower evenly across the perimeter, American commanders accepted local risk and retained small, mobile reserves positioned near likely penetration points. This ran counter to the instinct to defend everywhere equally. Iraqi doctrine historically emphasized uniform frontage, particularly when surrounded, to prevent panic at weak points. Chipyong-ni demonstrated that elasticity, even in a static defense, could absorb shocks that rigid layouts could not. The battle also challenged assumptions about morale under siege. Iraqi planning traditionally treated morale as a resource that steadily declined as casualties and isolation increased. Chipyong-ni indicated that morale could stabilize, or even harden, when defenders believed resupply and relief were feasible. The knowledge that logistics could reach them from the air altered the psychological environment inside the perimeter. Isolation became physical rather than existential. Iraqi generals recognized this distinction as critical. A force that expects relief fights differently from one that expects annihilation. There was also a doctrinal warning embedded in the attacker's experience. Iraqi officers noted that the attacking force at Chipyong-ni committed incrementally rather than achieving overwhelming local superiority at a decisive point early. Human wave tactics, effective against disorganized or retreating enemies, became catastrophically expensive against a disciplined, integrated defense. For Iraqi planners who had studied massed infantry assaults extensively, the battle reinforced the danger of assuming that numerical superiority could compensate for insufficient combined arms integration. Ultimately, Chipyong-ni forced Iraqi generals to reconsider encirclement as a psychological instrument. It was no longer automatically decisive. Against a force trained to operate independently, supplied through the air, and culturally conditioned to hold ground, encirclement could invert its purpose. It could bind the attacker into a costly, time-consuming engagement while the defender waited for the operational balance to shift. For Iraqi generals looking ahead rather than backward, the most consequential lesson of Chipyong-ni was how it anticipated modern battlefield asymmetry. The battle illustrated that technological superiority did not merely increase lethality. It reshaped decision-making itself. Encirclement, long treated as a culminating maneuver, became a test of systems rather than stamina. Iraqi planners began to recognize that against a force able to fuse sensors, fires, and logistics, the traditional indicators of impending collapse were unreliable. This realization gained renewed relevance after 1991. During the Gulf War, Iraqi units experienced a different but related shock. Coalition forces demonstrated that isolation could be imposed without physical encirclement. Precision airstrikes severed command nodes, radar coverage, and logistics corridors long before ground forces arrived. Chipyong-ni, studied retrospectively, appeared as an early warning of this shift. The Americans in 1951 had already shown that the side controlling airspace and information could decide the psychological terms of battle regardless of ground disposition. Iraqi officers also drew a sobering conclusion about deterrence. Encirclement had once functioned as a coercive signal, a way to compel surrender without complete destruction. Chipyong-ni suggested that such signaling depended heavily on shared assumptions. If one side no longer interpreted encirclement as fatal, the coercive value collapsed. This insight troubled Iraqi planners because it implied that certain threats lost credibility against opponents trained to absorb shock and remain static under fire. Another implication lay in the economics of warfare. Chipyong-ni demonstrated that a technologically integrated defender could trade ammunition and fuel for enemy manpower at ratios unfavorable to mass armies. Iraqi doctrine, influenced by resource constraints, traditionally favored conserving material while exploiting manpower. The case study warned that this balance could invert disastrously. An attacker relying on numerical superiority alone risked being consumed by industrial-scale firepower. By the late 1990s, Chipyong-ni was no longer read by Iraqi generals as a Korean War curiosity. It became a cautionary case about fighting the United States on American terms. It underscored that success required more than surrounding enemy units. It required denying them the air, disrupting their logistics beyond recovery, and fracturing their command culture simultaneously. Anything less risked creating a static battlefield where time and attrition favored the defender. In this sense, Chipyong-ni lingered in Iraqi military thought as a quiet warning. Encirclement without dominance across domains was not decisive. It was dangerous. The battle hinted that once an American unit chose to stand still, the real question was no longer whether it could be surrounded, but whether its enemy could afford to remain outside the perimeter long enough to matter. For Iraqi generals who continued revisiting Chipyong-ni into the final years before the 2003 invasion, the battle's enduring value lay in what it revealed about the limits of classical solutions. Encirclement, once a universal answer to battlefield resistance, had become conditional. Its success now depended on denying an opponent three things simultaneously: air control, logistical continuity, and confidence in higher command. Chipyong-ni showed that denying only one or two was insufficient. The Americans retained all three, and the result was not collapse but consolidation. This realization carried an uncomfortable strategic implication. If an encircled force could choose when and where the decisive moment occurred, then the attacker surrendered initiative by default. Time no longer punished the surrounded unit first. It punished the force expending manpower, morale, and political capital in repeated assaults. Iraqi planners understood that this inversion was not unique to Korea. It foreshadowed a broader transformation in warfare, where dominance was measured less by territory held than by systems sustained under pressure. Chipyong-ni also clarified why American military culture placed such emphasis on joint operations. The battle's outcome was not the product of a single weapon or formation, but of orchestration. Ground forces held. Air assets reshaped visibility and supply. Command systems maintained coherence. Each element alone was vulnerable. Together they formed a structure that encirclement could not easily fracture. Iraqi generals recognized, often too late, that confronting such an opponent required symmetrical integration, not asymmetrical persistence. In the end, Chipyong-ni remained unsettling because it stripped away comforting assumptions. It suggested that surrounding American troops did not guarantee surrender. In some cases, it guaranteed the opposite. The lesson was not about bravery or resolve in the abstract. It was about modern war's unforgiving arithmetic. When an army can fight from the air, sustain itself from the sky, and coordinate fires in all directions, the battlefield no longer closes in on it. It closes in on those who try. If you found this analysis valuable and want more deep examinations of military doctrine, technology, and the battles that reshaped modern warfare, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and enable notifications so you don't miss the next briefing.